October 15th, 1941. The sky over Kharkov was red. Somewhere far off, beyond the dark line of the horizon, Moscow was burning. The news came like a shock wave through the factory walls. The Germans are near. Evacuation begins tonight. Inside factory number 183, the heart of the Soviet tank industry, men and women froze mid-shift. The machines, roaring only seconds ago, coughed and fell silent. For a moment, it was quiet enough to hear the ticking of a clock above the main gate. Then came the orders, shouted over the metal echo of the emptying workshops. Stop all production. Dismantle every lathe, every press, every machine. Everything that moves, everything that makes steel move. The voice belonged to Chief Engineer Mikhail Berikov, a man whose hands were black with oil and whose eyes hadn't closed in 2 days. He looked around at the stunned faces, teenagers, mothers, old mechanics who had spent decades in these halls. You have 12 hours, he said. At dawn, the factory must be gone. Panic spread through the corridors, but no one argued. They knew what waited if they stayed. German bombers were already crossing the Dnieper. The night trembled with the distant hum of engines. By midnight, the great production halls looked like battlefields. Sparks flew as workers cut machines from their foundations. Every piece of equipment was marked in chalk, bolts numbered, cables coiled, molds packed in straw. The air smelled of burnt oil and cold iron. Somewhere in the corner, a young woman named Irina, barely 20, tightened the straps around a crate of blueprints. We'll lose them in transit, someone warned. She just smiled wearily. We won't. I memorized every line. Outside, snow was falling, thin, early flakes that melted on the hot metal of the train cars waiting by the tracks. The sound of hammering mixed with the rhythmic clank of couplings as one by one, wagons filled with dismantled industry. Men shouted numbers, checked lists, signed papers under lantern light. At 2 a.m, the power failed. The factory fell into darkness. No one stopped. They worked by flashlight, by the flicker of welding torches, by instinct. Somewhere above them, German planes droned unseen. When the bombs fell on the city's outskirts, the ground shook, but the workers didn't look up. Impossible, muttered a foreman as they lifted a generator onto a flat car. We can't finish in one night. Impossible, Berikov replied, is what we start with. By dawn, the last smokestacks of Kharkov's tank factory stood black against the rising fire of the eastern sky. On the horizon, the first German shells landed. The air shuddered, windows burst inward. Someone blew a whistle, one long, final note. It was the signal. Engines roared to life. 22 trains, each stretching nearly a mile, began to move east. In their wagons, machines, tools, blueprints, and 10,000 people who refused to surrender. The trains groaned forward, vanishing into the cold light of morning. From the last platform, Irina looked back. Smoke coiled above the city she had grown up in. She could still see the tall chimneys of the foundry, now glowing red from the reflection of fires. We built tanks here, she whispered. Now we'll build revenge. Behind her, the tracks shook under the weight of steel. A soldier guarding the convoy adjusted his rifle and muttered, You think they'll make it? Berikov, climbing aboard, answered without turning, They have to. Without this factory, there's no army left. As the last train disappeared into the freezing dawn, German planes circled above Kharkov. At 6:15 a.m., the first bombs hit the empty factory. The blast shattered every window still standing, tore roofs apart, and sent a plume of fire hundreds of feet into the air. Within hours, the complex that had once built 30 T-34s a day was nothing but twisted iron and ashes. But the heart of it, the workers, the machines, the blueprints, was already gone. Across the tracks, the last surviving watchman wrote one sentence in his notebook before leaving. They burned the walls, not the hands that built them. For the next 7 days, the convoy would move east, through snow, across bombed bridges, past villages filled with refugees, heading deep into the Urals, to a place that didn't yet exist on any map. There, in frozen ground and empty fields, they would build a new city from nothing. But that was still ahead. For now, only the rails spoke, metal against metal, echoing through the endless night as the trains carried away the hope of a nation. And when the last whistle faded behind the hills, Kharkov's horizon flared once more. The factory that had armed an empire was gone. The city burned, silent except for the wind and the distant rumble of retreating trains. No one in those carriages looked back again, because what they carried wasn't just steel. It was the future. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. They left Kharkov in the dark, heading east toward a land none of them had seen. 22 trains, each a moving city of steel and exhaustion, crawling through snow and smoke. No lights, no signals, only the whistle of cold air and the thudding rhythm of wheels against frozen rails. The carriages were packed tight. Workers slept sitting up on crates marked precision bearings or engine components. Children lay under tarps, wrapped in old blueprints instead of blankets. Someone boiled water on a tin stove made from a tank's exhaust pipe. When the train stopped, they used the embers to warm their hands. When it moved again, they kept working. In one of the wagons, Engineer Morozov sat with a notebook on his knees, tracing tank schematics by candlelight. The pages shook with every jolt. Across from him, a welder named Sergei stared out through a slit in the wooden wall. The countryside was nothing but white emptiness and scattered villages. "You think we'll ever get there?" he asked. Morozov didn't look up. "We'll stop when the rails end," he said. They had been on the move for days. The air inside the wagon stank of oil, smoke, and wet wool. Outside, the cold sharpened to a metallic edge. When they passed through bombed-out stations, they could see other convoys, factories on wheels, fleeing from every corner of the collapsing front. From Leningrad, from Kiev, from Bryansk, all heading east, away from the fire. Sometimes the train stopped for hours, stranded by air raids or blocked tracks. When that happened, the workers poured out to repair rails with their bare hands. They carried no guards, no soldiers, only tools. Every minute counted. Every stop could mean the difference between salvation and capture. A diary entry from a locomotive mechanic reads, "We rode through the night with no light, no heat. I fixed the engine by touch. When the bombs fell near Oral, I thought, this is it. But the train kept moving. I think it wanted to live as much as we did." By the 5th day, food was running out. The workers shared what little they had: dry bread, frozen potatoes, pickled cabbage. One woman brewed tea from pine needles. When the smell spread through the wagon, people laughed for the first time in weeks. "Smells like home," someone said. Behind them, the world was dying. Moscow prepared for siege, and the Wehrmacht advanced like an iron tide. Yet in these trains, something defiant pulsed, a rhythm of bolts clinking in wooden crates, of hearts refusing to slow. They weren't soldiers, but their mission was as critical as any battle. Rebuild the factory, restart production, and give the front its armor back. Somewhere near the Ural foothills, disaster struck. A German reconnaissance plane appeared from behind the clouds. The sound was faint at first, then a piercing dive. The siren wailed. Workers threw themselves flat on the floorboards. A bomb exploded near the tracks, tearing up a section of rail. One wagon derailed, spilling crates of spare parts into the snow. Smoke rose, black and greasy. Morozov climbed out, coughing. The draft blueprints, hundreds of sheets, were burning in the snowdrift. For a second, he just stared. Then he grabbed a handful of half-burnt pages and whispered, "We remember." That night, he sat by the wreckage, redrawing from memory everything that was lost. The next morning, when another train caught up with them, the survivors loaded what they could and moved on. The rest stayed behind to clear the rails. There was no time to mourn, no time to count the dead. Every delay meant fewer tanks at the front. After nearly 2 weeks, the convoy finally reached the edge of the Urals, Nizhny Tagil, a frozen plain surrounded by forest and iron-rich hills. But when the workers stepped out, they saw nothing waiting for them. No factory, no buildings, not even a proper rail line, just wind, snow, and a patch of bare, frozen earth. Someone muttered, "This can't be right." Barikov, who had led the convoy, pointed to the horizon. "This is it," he said. "Here we build again." The words hung in the air like frost. Around them, the temperature dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. The snow cracked underfoot like glass. A few of the younger workers cried quietly, but the veterans unpacked their tools and started marking the ground. That night, the first fires were lit. Wooden planks became walls. Crates became tables. A sign was nailed to a tree. Factory number 183, temporary site. There was no power, no shelter, and almost no hope. But the trains had brought more than machines. They had brought the memory of how to build. A line from Irina's notebook reads, "We have no roof, but we have our hands. Tomorrow, we start digging." As the workers fell asleep beside the tracks, snow began to cover the silent locomotives. Somewhere in the distance, another train whistle echoed. More factories, more people fleeing west to east. The war was swallowing everything. But in that frozen emptiness, a new front was about to be born, not of soldiers, but of builders. And by morning, shovels were already striking the ground. When the train stopped, the silence was complete. The sound of engines and iron wheels faded into wind and emptiness. They had reached the end of the line, literally. Before them stretched a flat, white plain outside Nizhny Tagil, surrounded by dark fir trees and the distant shadows of the Ural Mountains. No buildings, no roads, not even a proper rail yard. Just snow and frozen ground. The workers stood in disbelief. Someone whispered, "Where's the factory?" Engineer Barykov pointed to the empty horizon. "There," he said, "under the snow." The words hit like an order. Within an hour, men and women were digging trenches, marking foundations with sticks and ropes. The ground was hard as iron. Shovels sparked against the frost. Hands bled, but no one stopped. They built shelters first, holes in the ground lined with tarps, then crude wooden barracks roofed with metal sheets taken from train cars. Smoke from campfires curled into the freezing air. The snow glowed orange in the light of burning diesel. Inside these makeshift tents, they unpacked machines. Lathes, presses, molds, each one numbered and wrapped like treasure. Crates became tables. A single generator hummed, feeding one flickering bulb. Under its light, Irina spread a bundle of half-burned blueprints. Her fingers were swollen from the cold, but she traced every line from memory. "This is all we have," she murmured. "It will be enough." At night, the wind howled through the camp. It tore down tarps, scattered papers, froze the oil in the barrels. Workers huddled in blankets, sleeping in shifts. When the diesel stoves went out, they burned wooden planks meant for construction. The smoke smelled of resin and desperation. In the morning, the hammering began again. They worked through storms, through darkness. Women rolled steel plates by hand. Teenagers carried sandbags. Old machinists taught the younger ones how to cut metal without power, turning the crankshafts by muscle alone. By the third day, the first building frame rose, a skeleton of wood and iron. They called it Workshop 1. It was barely large enough to house a single assembly line, but it was a beginning. In his diary, Foreman Yakovlev wrote, "We live like miners under open sky. Every breath is smoke. Every tool burns your skin. But the machines are alive. You can feel it when they turn, the heartbeat of something bigger than us." When the first snowfall of December buried the camp completely, they dug out the roofs with shovels and carried on. They had no choice. On the radio, they heard the news. German tanks were approaching Moscow. The Red Army was desperate for armor. Orders came by telegram. No greetings, no signatures. Production must begin immediately. Deliver T-34. It sounded impossible. They didn't even have walls yet. But impossible had already become routine. Barykov gathered the crew inside the half-built workshop. His voice was hoarse, half lost to frostbite. "We'll build the first one under the stars if we have to," he said. "Who's with me?" No one answered. They just went back to work. That was answer enough. The assembly line took shape piece by piece. Steel beams scavenged from the train cars formed the supports. Engines were assembled under tarps to keep the snow off. Oil froze solid in the barrels. They heated it over open fires. Sparks from the welding torches flew like fireflies into the darkness. And then, one morning, a sound broke through the blizzard, the deep, uneven rumble of an engine coming to life. For a moment, no one moved. The workers turned, faces covered in soot and frost. A small crowd gathered around the source of the noise. There it was, a tank. Rough edges, unpainted, but standing proud on its own treads. The first T-34 built on Ural soil. Irina wiped grease from her face and laughed for the first time in months. "He's alive," she said softly. They didn't cheer. There was no time for that. The tank was loaded onto a flat car that same night, bound for the front. As it rolled away, the workers stood in silence, the wind biting their faces. In his next diary entry, Yakovlev wrote, "We didn't clap or shout. We just watched the tracks disappear, because we knew there would be thousands more." By January, the camp had become a city of smoke and steel. The nights were still freezing, but the sky glowed red from furnaces that burned without pause. New workshops rose one after another, their walls covered in frost and soot. Children carried buckets of sand to douse sparks. Mothers worked night shifts beside their sons. The official reports called it Ural Factory Number 183. The workers called it something else, the factory in the snow. When an inspector from Moscow finally arrived, expecting chaos, he found precision. Every machine in place, every tool accounted for. "How did you manage this?" he asked Barykov. Barykov just smiled, his face blackened with ash. "We never stopped," he said. "Not even when we had nothing." That night, another convoy left for the front. The sky was full of falling snow, the flakes catching the orange glow of the furnaces. The inspector watched them vanish into the dark, the tank's engines rumbling like distant thunder. He turned to Irina, who was checking a new batch of armor plates. "You're not even celebrating," he said. She shrugged. "When there are no more trains to send," she replied, "then we'll celebrate." The wind rose again, carrying the smell of diesel and burning coal. Somewhere out on the steppe, a wolf howled. But in the heart of that frozen wasteland, the factory kept breathing. And soon, it would roar. It was December 1941. The wind from the Urals cut like a blade, dry and bitter, carrying the sting of metal dust and coal smoke. In the open yard of the half-built factory, a handful of workers stood around something that didn't belong to the landscape, a shape under a crust of snow, glimmering faintly in the firelight. It was their first T-34, built without walls, without heat, without rest. They called it the tank of snow and steel. The engine had never been tested. The mechanics had thawed its fuel lines over open flames, scraping frost off with the edges of screwdrivers. A woman with cracked, bleeding hands held the ignition key like a relic. Her name was Irina, the same young drafter who had carried the blueprints from Kharkov. "Ready?" someone shouted through the wind. No one answered. The men just stepped back. Then came a sound that froze them all. The cough of the V2 diesel engine, deep and uncertain at first, like a wounded animal gasping for breath. For a few seconds, it sputtered. Then it caught. A roar filled the air. The snow that had gathered on the tank's armor began to melt. Steam rose from its sides. Someone started to laugh, then choke, then cry. Not from joy, from exhaustion. In that moment, every blister, every hour spent in darkness, every frozen breath found its meaning. They hadn't built a machine. They had built a heartbeat. The tank rumbled forward half a meter, tracks grinding through ice. Sparks flew where the metal met frozen earth. Then it stopped again, breathing through its exhaust. The workers just stood there, watching the heat shimmer off the hull, the steam turning into frost midair. No one cheered. There was no strength left for celebration. A mechanic wiped his face with a greasy rag and whispered, "If it moves, we live." Far to the west, the Wehrmacht was closing around Moscow. The newspapers spoke only of retreat and collapse. But here, 1,500 miles away, in a place that wasn't even on most maps, a new kind of army was being born, one made of factories, fire, and human will. At night, when the tank was loaded onto a train bound for the front, Irina stayed behind, standing in the yard until the noise faded. Snow began to fall again, gentle and slow, settling over the empty frame of another unfinished hull. She looked up at the black sky and whispered, "Now go." 2 weeks later, there were 10 tanks. A month later, 100. They came off the line half-finished, rough, raw. Weld seams like scars, armor plates from recycled scrap, bolts cut by hand. But they moved. They fought. And that was enough. In his diary, engineer Morozov wrote, "We built the first one under the open sky, the second under snow, the third under shellfire, the fourth under hope." The temperature stayed below -30 degrees Celsius. The workers' eyelashes froze. They lit fires inside empty tank hulls to warm their fingers before tightening bolts. The air inside the workshops shimmered with heat and frost at once, a strange, ghostly glow that made the walls seem alive. Someone painted on the side of the first tank to leave the yard, from Tajil to the front, with love. The phrase became a ritual. Each new machine carried its own inscription, each one a message from the invisible army of the Urals. The rhythm of the plant never stopped. Sparks flew through the air day and night. The pounding of presses echoed like artillery. When one machine broke, its parts were melted and reused to build another. Waste didn't exist. There was no such thing as spare. The first supply train took 3 days to reach Moscow. By then, the front had frozen solid. The German advance stalled in blizzards. Soldiers who climbed into those fresh, unpainted tanks didn't know the story of how they'd been made. They only knew that they ran, and that the steel didn't break. One of them, a young lieutenant near Klin, later wrote in a letter, "The paint hasn't even dried. The seat is still warm from the factory. I don't know who built this tank, but tell them, it works." Back in Tajil, the workers heard the same news on the radio. The Germans had stopped. The Red Army was counterattacking. Somewhere out there, their tanks were part of it. The next day, production doubled. There was no announcement, no meeting, just an unspoken decision. The lines moved faster, the furnaces burned hotter. The cold still bit through every coat. The diesel smoke still stung the eyes, but the faces had changed. The fear that had haunted them through evacuation was gone. Now, there was something else, purpose. When a war correspondent arrived in January 1942, he found the factory roaring under a storm. Sparks leapt from the open sheds, lighting up the snow like fireflies. "Where are your engineers?" he asked. A foreman, his beard coated in frost, nodded toward the welding torches. "All of them," he said. "Every one." The correspondent described it later. It was not a factory. It was a volcano, and every eruption was a tank. The tank of snow and steel became a legend before anyone realized it. Moscow held. The German advance broke. And from the frozen depths of the Urals, a new tide of armor began to flow west. Quiet, relentless, unstoppable. No one in Tajil celebrated that winter. They just kept building. Because for them, the sound of that first engine still echoed in their ears, louder than any victory. And they knew the war had only just begun. No one in Tajil asked how long a shift lasted anymore. Time had dissolved into rhythm. The clang of hammers, the hiss of welding torches, the endless rumble of conveyor chains. Some worked 12 hours, some 20. No one counted. They measured days in tanks, not hours. The factory never slept. At night, the yard glowed red from the furnaces, the snow outside turning the color of blood. Inside, faces moved through the smoke like ghosts. Women, boys, old men. Every hand had a task. One tightened bolts. Another stirred soup inside an empty turret. Another wiped oil from a gearbox with the sleeve of a winter coat. They lived there, among the machines. Bunks were made from crates. Steam from the boilers condensed on the ceilings, dripping like rain. When the shift ended, workers slept where they stood. A new whistle would blow, and they'd wake without opening their eyes, walking back to the line as if pulled by instinct. The air smelled of oil and iron. It never went away. Even the bread tasted faintly of metal. An entry from Irina's notebook reads, "We used to call this a factory. Now it feels like a heartbeat. If it stops, the front dies." Every day, the telegrams came, lists of losses, urgent demands. Need 300 T-34s by end of month. Priority, Moscow. The papers never mentioned that most of those tanks were born here, in freezing sheds filled with children who had never seen a battlefield. The war had turned the factory into a front line without guns. "We are soldiers," said one of the old machinists, "just without uniforms." His words became a motto, whispered over every shift change. Outside, the world narrowed to snow and smoke. The town that grew around the plant, rows of wooden huts, frozen pipes, soot-stained windows, breathed in rhythm with the factory itself. At night, the ground trembled from the hammering of presses. Mothers woke their children to feed them, then sent them back to sleep under the echoing thunder of steel. The statistics were astonishing even then. By early 1942, the Tajil plant was producing more than 1,000 tanks a month, half of all Soviet armor. 60% of the workforce were women and teenagers. Some were as young as 14. They learned fast. Mistakes meant explosions, burns, sometimes death. But no one quit. There was nowhere to go, and too much to lose. Do you hear that? Irina asked one night, pausing beside a press that shook the floor. Morozov listened. The rhythm was steady, heavy. That's the sound of life, she said. When supplies ran out, they made replacements from whatever they could find, melted rail spikes for bolts, car parts for bearings. Once, when the plant ran out of paint, they coated the tanks in a mixture of coal dust and oil. It turned them black, like shadows. Meals were simple: boiled potatoes, thin soup, bread made from barley husks. Yet even that was shared. Workers carried mugs of hot tea to welders who couldn't leave their stations. When someone collapsed, others lifted them aside gently, sat them against a wall, and kept working. An army officer visited the plant in spring 1942. He watched a woman hammer rivets into a turret while holding a child in her other arm. "How long have you been on shift?" he asked. She shrugged. "Since yesterday," she said, without stopping. That night, the officer wrote in his report, "This place fights a different kind of war. No trenches, no rifles, only courage made of iron." By June, the walls of the main workshop were covered in chalk numbers. Each tank received a mark before it left the yard, a silent promise. The workers began to name them: Hope, Motherland, Revenge, Number 22. The names were scratched onto armor plates with nails or bits of wire. When photographs from the front finally arrived, they were passed around in the canteen. Black and white images of snowy fields, broken tanks, soldiers smiling beside familiar shapes. One showed a T-34 with a crooked weld seam that Irina recognized. "That's ours," she whispered. "It made it." The pictures spread from hand to hand. Nobody spoke. They didn't need to. For the first time, they saw proof that their work had reached the war, that the steel they forged here in darkness was saving lives somewhere beyond the horizon. In a letter smuggled back from a Red Army unit, a commander wrote, "Your tanks don't stop. Even when hit, they keep moving. Tell your workers, they saved my men." That night, the workers didn't sleep at all, not from pride, but from purpose. The presses thundered until dawn, the factory pulsing like a living thing. 3 tanks today," someone shouted. Tomorrow, 5. They had stopped thinking of themselves as builders. They were the bloodstream of the army, carrying iron and fire to where it was needed most. As one old man said before returning to his lathe, "Sleep is for peace, and we haven't earned that yet." Outside, the Ural wind screamed through the yard, scattering snow over tracks of steel and oil. But the fires inside never went out. Because in Tagil, rest was a luxury only the dead could afford. By mid-1942, the impossible had become routine. What began as a cluster of frozen tents was now the beating heart of a war machine. The Urals burned with light even at midnight, furnaces roaring, rails trembling, trains screaming westward under the weight of armor. From Moscow came disbelief. Reports said the relocated plants were producing more tanks than pre-war Europe combined. The numbers looked like fantasy, thousands each month, from workshops still patched with tarps. "You're exaggerating," a party inspector told Morozov when he visited Tagil. Morozov only smiled and pointed toward the horizon. There, through the snow, a line of tanks stretched like a metallic river disappearing into darkness. "Count them yourself," he said. Every factory across the Urals had joined the tide. Chelyabinsk, Tankograd, Uralmash and Sverdlovsk. The merged plants of Leningrad, Kharkov, Moscow, all reborn on the steppe. Together they produced more than half of the Soviet Union's weapons. The front line might have been 1,000 miles away, but the war's true front ran through these assembly halls. Inside Tagil's main shed, the rhythm never stopped. Sparks burst like fireworks. The clang of armor plates drowned out conversation. When power failed, welders worked by lantern light. A worker could finish his shift and never hear his own name spoken once. They had become extensions of the machines they tended. To the west, cities were falling. Kharkov again, Sevastopol, Rostov. Every loss tightened their resolve. They couldn't stop the retreat, but they could replace what was lost. One telegram arrived from a frontline commander: "Send replacements immediately. Our tanks are dying faster than men." The answer was the same from every plant: "Already on the way." The Tagil tanks left the yard bare, still hot from welding. There was no time to paint them, no insignia, no finish. Some bore fingerprints pressed into soft primer. Others still smelled of diesel smoke. They were rushed straight onto flat cars and sent toward Stalingrad, toward Kursk, toward the places where the war would turn again. At the loading platforms, workers watched each train depart. The sound of the engines faded into the wind. They didn't wave. They simply stood still, listening. It was as if part of themselves was leaving with every wagon. "Each one is a soldier," Irina said quietly. "And we built an army." By autumn, the numbers were staggering. 15,000 T-34s had rolled out of Tagil alone. Entire battalions now bore the same handwriting. Notes scratched into the steel. For Moscow, for Mother, for those who fell. In the offices, engineers worked on the next model. Wider tracks, stronger armor, faster gun rotation. They sketched revisions in the margins of blueprints smeared with oil. The design room had no windows. Only the faint hum of generators and the ticking of a clock no one bothered to set. When word came that the Germans were pulling back from Stalingrad, the factory didn't celebrate. They increased production again. "The more we win," Morozov said, "the more we owe the ones who didn't." It wasn't heroism that kept them moving, it was necessity. Every worker understood that their machines were the only wall between survival and extinction. One welder, his face hidden behind a soot-covered mask, muttered, "If I stop, someone dies." And so no one stopped. By now, the factory had become something beyond human scale. The earth shook day and night. The air vibrated with noise, smoke, and rhythm. The people were smaller, thinner, quieter, but their creation had become vast, powerful, almost alive. Foreign observers began to hear rumors. American attaches rode home in disbelief. They build tanks in open fields. They fight the cold as if it were an enemy. Yet they deliver numbers our plants can't match. Some called it industrial miracle. Others, sacrifice. Morozov simply said, "It's war." When the first snow of 1943 fell, the tracks of hundreds of tanks scarred the ground outside Tagil, stretching westward like veins of steel. The workers stood at the gates, breath steaming in the cold, faces blackened with soot. Behind them, the furnaces burned brighter than ever. This was no longer a factory. It was a weapon, one forged from exhaustion, stubbornness, and belief. And now, that weapon was ready to strike back. By 1943, the snow around Tagil no longer stayed white. Soot drifted from the furnaces and settled over the town like a second winter. The factory's pulse set the hours, sirens at dawn, whistles at dusk, the long, iron breath that never paused between. When the front finally began to move west, the people in Tagil didn't march with it. They stayed where they had always stood, beside presses, forges, and rails that led away into the night. An American military attaché arrived that spring, his coat still smelling of coal smoke from the train. He walked the length of the main shed with a notebook open and his mouth half open too, as if the scale of it all had pushed the words from his lungs. He wrote later, "I have seen a city that lives for one purpose. This is not a plant. It is an organism." The line circulated in Moscow as a compliment. In Tagil, no one read it. They were too busy counting bolts. The numbers hardened into fact. By the end of 1943, more T-34s rolled out of the Urals each month than Germany could replace in a season. Entire brigades arrived at the front wearing the same rough weld seam, the same hurried primer, the same chalked message beneath the hatch. For Mother, for Tagil, for the fallen. The army gave speeches about courage. The factory answered with freight schedules. Inside the design room, blueprints multiplied like veins. Wider tracks for spring mud. Stronger gearbox bearings to survive the frozen shifts. A faster turret ring so a tank could swing its gun before a panther found its flank. Morozov sketched in the margins with a carpenter's pencil, the wood worn flat by his teeth. Irina measured armor plates by touch, palms sliding over steel still warm from the press. "It's straight," she'd say. "Send it." Shift changes blurred. The teenager who had once carried water now set gauges. The widow at the rivet line taught 3 new girls to keep the hammer's rhythm steady so the plate wouldn't warp. A boy wrote his father's name on the inside of every turret he inspected, as if sending a letter the war could not lose. The factory clerk kept a ledger of accidents in a hand so neat it looked like prayer. He never caught up. They heard about Kursk on a Sunday morning. News read aloud beneath a catwalk while the presses idled just long enough to stretch aching fingers. The T-34s had held, then pushed. At Stalingrad, they had helped close a ring of steel. In the steppe, They cut tracks where no road existed. A tank commander wrote back to the plant, "Your engines start after a night that kills men." The letter was posted by the canteen door. People touched it as they passed. By 1944, Tajil had its own weather. The sky glowed amber at midnight. Snow fell black on the sheds and hissed to steam when it met the armor plate. The ground shook even when no train moved. In the houses beyond the gates, children learned to sleep through thunder that wasn't thunder, to find warmth where the wall met the stove, to recognize their parents by the sound of their boots at the door. The town belonged to the factory, and the factory belonged to the war. Foreign visitors called it an industrial miracle. The workers used a different word, routine. If the steel came thin, they doubled it. If the rivets ran short, they melted scrap rail. If a crane jammed, they rigged pulleys from cable and swore at the cold until it let go. They made do, then made more. When a foreman died at his station one January night, the line paused for 12 minutes. The priest said a few words over the engine block that served as an altar. Then the whistle blew, and the tank moved on. In 1945, when Berlin was a rumor and the trains began to carry soldiers home instead of tanks out, Tajil did not ring bells. Production tapered only when orders stopped arriving. Men came back missing pieces of themselves and sat quietly at kitchen tables, staring at fingers that no longer knew how to be idle. Irina folded her measuring tape and put it in a drawer she never opened again. Morozov pushed his last blueprint into a metal tube and wrote one word on it. Enough, as if the war could be filed and shelved. The official histories would later list the totals. More than 50,000 T-34s by war's end, the majority from the Urals, the single largest output of armored strength the world had yet seen. They would note the strategy, the logistics, the economics of victory. But the ledgers could not capture what the factory had spent. Years measured in shifts, youth spent like fuel, names lost to the rhythm of the presses. The front moved because Tajil refused to stop. When peace finally settled, a thin, uncertain quiet, the town discovered that silence was a sound you had to relearn. The furnaces cooled, and the first true snow in years fell clean. People stepped outside and listened to nothing. It felt wrong, then tender, then sacred. A memorial went up beside the gate. Not a statue of a general, not a banner of triumph. Just a simple plate of steel set on a concrete block, rough edges still visible, weld seemed crooked as a scar. Under it, a line was cut with a shaky hand. Here they made time for the front. On the first Sunday of every May, old men stand by that plate in their oil-stained coats, and young workers carry flowers across palms still nicked by steel. No bands play. The wind from the Urals blows hard and clean, and the factory behind them breathes more softly than it once did. They do not speak long. There isn't much to add, because the truth is simple and hard. The war was won far from the parades, won by hands that worked until metal obeyed, by people who learned to forge hope into shape and send it west on rails. And history, if it is honest, will remember that the heart of victory was not a battlefield at all, but a furnace that refused to go out.